There are various types of query in Access, including append queries, update queries, aggregate queries, etc. This first video is just going to show you how to do straightforward searching and sorting, and that's called a selection query. And the data that we're going to use as the basis of these queries is this country information here, which includes various pieces of information about countries, including the name, how big they are, the population, etc. So to begin a query, we're first of all going to go to the Create tab. Now I'm using Access 2007 here, so query design is in the other section, but more recent versions of Access have a separate queries block on the toolbar. So I'm going to click query design. I always use query design, I don't bother with the wizard. And the first thing that you do is you choose the table that you want to use. So there's two steps involved when you want to find a query to produce a set of results or answer a question. The first thing is to think about what you want to see when you look at those results or when you look at the answer to the question. So would you want to see the name of the country, for example? And then the second thing to think about is how you will find those results. Which fields do you need to look in, and what are the criteria going to be? So the first step is the country. So I double click, and we can see the country appears in the top section of the query, and I'm just going to close that now. You can include multiple tables and indeed other queries in a query, and there'll be videos later on how to do that. So if we expand that window there, we can see all the different fields in the table. The bottom section of the query controls what appears in the query results. So at the moment it's blank, which means the query is going to have no results. If we want to include a field in the results, we can either double click it, in which case it appears at the bottom, or in the top row of that table at the bottom we can click on the combo box and we can choose the name of a country. If we've got multiple tables, we can also select a table first, and obviously that will affect which countries, which fields appear in the top box. So at the moment I've only selected a country and I've not selected to do anything with it, so there's no selection criteria, there's no sorting. When you're doing pretty much anything in Access, the most important button is probably the top left button. The top left button here toggles between the design view, which is where you choose what you want, and the datasheet view, which is the results of the query. So if I click this button now, I can see what that query will show me. I can click on the arrow and choose some other options, which we'll have a look at in other videos as well. So the reason I've left the table open is that we can see, I compare the results of my query with the table, and you can see that because I've just selected the first field, the country name, then my query is basically the same as the first column from the table. So that doesn't do a great deal at the moment. If I want to save the query, I can click the disk button at the top, or indeed if I try and close the query it'll ask me if I want to save it, but I won't do that just yet because I don't know what to call it, because it doesn't really do anything at the moment. So I'm going to go back to the design view. So one of the first things you might want to do is sort that information into order. So at the moment that country field isn't really in order. It starts at Switzerland and then it goes Luxembourg, Japan, so it jumps around all over the place. So what I might want to do is sort that. So I'm going to go look in the table at the bottom. The third row down is the sort order. So if I want to sort this field into order, I've got a choice of ascending, which will be alphabetical because it's a text field, or descending, which is reverse alphabetical. If it's a different type, so if it's numerical or date order, ascending will mean starting at 0 and going upwards, and descending will mean reverse numerical order. So if I want the countries to appear in alphabetical order, I can just select ascending, and now if I look at it, the list is in alphabetical order from Afghanistan at the top, and we can scroll down to Zimbabwe at the bottom. The other thing that an Access query does is it tells us at the bottom how many records match. So unlike Excel where we have to count them, Access does that work for us. So we've sorted that. If I add another column or another field, so if I add continent as well, so we can see where that where those countries are. If I run that query, we can now see all the countries in order, and we can see where they are, what continent they're in. But the continents aren't sorted because they're in order of country. So if I select now to sort those continents, what do you think will happen? Well, not a lot's happened. It hasn't really had any effect. And the reason for that is when you're sorting in a query, it does the sorting from left to right. So all the ones that you've chosen to sort, it'll start with the leftmost one and do that first. So it's sorting country first, and then it's sorting continent. And because there's only one country with each name, it's sorting all the Afghanistan continents into order, and then it's sorting all the Albanian continents into order. But because there's only one of each, that's not really doing anything. So if you want to sort them into continent order, what you need to do is you need to have continent to the left of country. And we can click and drag if we want to do that. So now continents first. And so they're sorted into continent order. So Africa's first, followed by Asia, followed by Europe. We're still looking at all 146 countries, as we can see at the bottom. And then within each continent, the countries are also in order. So Algeria, Angola, etc. And down as far as Zimbabwe. And then we start again at A for Asia. So we can sort in different orders by changing the order of the columns. You might not always want to do that. So there's a couple of ways around it, and probably the best way is to use SQL. So if I say something's not really possible using a query, you can almost certainly do it in SQL, and we'll look at that in a future video. The other thing to do is, what you can do is you can add a column twice. So if I add country, and I can shift it over to the left, so I can show it at the start, and then show continent, and then where it actually gets sorted is in the third column. So if I run that query now, what we can see is the countries are on the left, but they're sorted in order of continent first. So you can sort of bodge it like that if you like. And you think that, well, but you might be thinking, well, I don't want country twice. So what you can also do, the fourth row down is this show tick box, and that controls whether or not the column appears in the results of the query. So you can use a field or a column to find the results and to order them, but it doesn't have to actually appear. So I can choose to sort by country, but not actually show it. In this case, then it looks like we're sorting them in order of country, but we're actually sorting in order of the invisible one. So that's a little bit of a tricky example, but that's something to watch out for. When you sort, it always sorts from left to right. So I'll just go back to sorting like that. Okay, so I'm just sorting the countries in order and showing where they are. So the next thing you might want to do is actually just find a subsection. So at the moment we've only looked at all 146 countries. What about if I want to find just the European countries? Well, first thing, I need to add to my query the field that contains that information. So the field that contains the information about whether the country is in Europe is the continent, which I've already got there. And then if I only want to find certain matching records on the criteria row, which is the fourth row down, I type in what I'm looking for. So I'll just type in the word Europe. Now Access is quite forgiving. You should really put speech marks around it, but as soon as I click away, it'll put those in for me, so that's fine. That's just for text. For numbers, it's okay to leave them out. Okay, so if I run this now, what we'll see is a list of countries in alphabetical order. They're all in Europe, and we can see now at the bottom there's only 27 of them. So we've found a subset of those countries, just the ones that are in Europe. And if you look at that, well, you might be thinking, okay, we've got the continent there, but it says Europe all the way down. That's not particularly helpful. We don't need to see that, really. So again, we can use the show button to hide things that we don't really need to see. There's not much point in a whole column of Europes. So I can untick that box, and I can see that we've got a list of countries that are in Europe, but it's only showing the country name, and it's still only showing the European ones because there's 27 in the list. So if we want to find one thing, we can either type in the word or the number that we're looking for. If we wanted to find out two things, so if we wanted to find out countries with a literacy rate of 100, for example, we can just add that extra field, and we can put in 100. So literacy is the percentage of people that can read in that country, so it's a number. So now when I run this query, it's only showing 15 results. So what that is currently showing is countries from Europe with a literacy rate of 100%. And again, you might not need to include that literacy column because we know that it's 100 because that's our criteria. Notice that when I put those two criteria in there, it's using an implicit and. So it's showing countries that are in Europe and that have a literacy rate of 100%. Notice that on the next row down from the word criteria, it's the word or. So if you want to do a different query, if you wanted to find out all the ones that were in Europe or had a literacy rate of 100%, then we can type the 100 on a separate row. So the same row is and, different rows is or. So now, obviously we're expecting a bigger number of matches because we're expecting all of the 27 European countries plus the ones with a literacy rate of 100%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the continent again just so we can see. So we can see that obviously Australia isn't in Europe, but it has got a literacy rate of 100%. So now we're looking at ones in Europe or a literacy rate of 100%. So we're also getting ones outside Europe that have 100. We're also getting ones inside Europe that have got less. So if we wanted to make sure that the European countries also had a literacy rate of 100%, we could put 100 in there as well. And what that would mean is countries in Europe that had 100. So Europe, continent is Europe and literacy is 100, or literacy is 100. So European countries. So this will European countries with 100% literacy rate, or those from elsewhere as well. Obviously, there's not much point in that because you could just put the 100 in there, but I'm just showing you that that's possible. So Oceania, Australia, Japan is in Asia, and New Zealand is in Oceania as well. Okay, so we can do that. What we can also do, if we don't want an exact match, is we can use some other symbols. So we can use all the mathematical symbols, such as greater than or less than. So rather than saying 100, so if you put 100 in, it means equals 100, but you can use greater than and less than. So you could say greater than 90. And now if I run that query, what we'll see is one's greater than 90. And there's 45 of those. We can also obviously combine those things. So we could look for the European countries where literacy rate is greater than 90. So we can have multiple criteria there as well. So we can have greater than, less than. If you want greater than or equal to, so at the moment greater than 90, remember, means more than 90. So it wouldn't include 90. The symbol for greater than or equal to is slightly different from the one you might be used to in maths, because we can't type the symbol that you'd use in maths. We use separate greater than or equal symbols. So that would mean greater than or equal to. So that should include some 90s if indeed there are any. There don't actually appear to be any, so it hasn't made any practical difference in that case. And less than or equal to would be similar. And then what we could also do is you can use greater than and less than together to mean not equal to. So if you wanted not equal to 100, obviously in that case that would be the same as less than 100, but we can see that that omits the ones that are 100. So not equal to, we use a greater than and less than symbol together. We can also use the word not. So we can say not Europe, and that would exclude Europe. So that's found everything but Europe. In the previous video I showed filtering, and you can actually filter the results of queries as well. So if you do a query and it's not quite what you want, you can actually tweak the results afterwards, although I would recommend getting your query right, because obviously, because you can save a query, you'd have to do that every time, but it's useful in this case just to check whether Europe is in the list, and we can see that it isn't. And the other thing we can do is we can use what we call wildcards. So a wildcard is like a partial match. So if you remember when we did the filtering, we had things like begins with or ends with or contains. You can do that in a slightly different way in a query. So if you want to see whether something begins with A, you'd use A star or A asterisk. So that's the Shift and the 8 key. What the asterisk represents is any string of characters. So what A star would mean is A followed by anything. Okay, so we can do that. Notice when I click away as the like. So if you're writing an SQL query from scratch, or you're doing this in some sort of programming language, you need to remember to put the like in yourself. But as I said, Access is quite forgiving, does that for you. So what this will find me now is countries whose names begin with A. And we can see there's, well, there's 7 of them. We don't even need to count them up. It tells us at the bottom. So we can use a wildcard to find partial matches. So partial matches, not partial matches. And we can, if we have star A, what that will tell us is ones that end in A. So there's actually more of those. 55 countries have a name that end in A. Notice also that it's not case sensitive. So I've used a capital A in my query, but none of the countries have a capital A at the end, but it still found them. And if we use 2 star symbols, what we can do is we could say, well, I wonder how many countries have land in the name. So let's have a look. We can run that, and actually 10 countries have land in their name. Notice that it finds it so where it occurs at the end, and it would also find it where it occurs at the start. So the star can represent any string of characters, including none. There are other symbols that you can use in wildcards, but the star is probably the most likely one. You can look those up. They're called wildcards. And if you do a search for wildcards access or wildcards SQL, it'll tell you that. Okay, so we've looked so far at adding fields, and you can add as many of those as you like, including adding them multiple times. We can sort using the sort row, and remember that it starts from left to right. We can choose whether or not the field appears in the results, so you can include a field as part of your criteria or your sort order, but you don't have to actually show it. And we've looked at adding criteria on one field or more than one field, and using and or. And we've also looked at other types of comparisons, so greater than, less than, not, and wildcards. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to straightforward queries, so searching and sorting. Look through the following videos for things like aggregation and doing calculations in fields, and also for renaming fields. When you finished your query, what you want to do is save it and give it a name so that you can run it again. So if I want to save this query now, I'm going to give it a name. So I'll click the disk, but if I'd closed the query, it would have asked me if I wanted to save that anyway. So I'm going to give it a name which reminds me what it does. So I'm going to call it query, I'll just call it land. So because it's showing me all the countries with land in the name, and I'll click OK. So what it'll do is it'll save the query. What it saves is not the results, but the instructions on how to find the query. So I can get back and edit my query again by clicking the right button and going to Design View. If I just double click it, it will show me the results. So it will show me there the countries, obviously, that have land in their name, and there's 10 of those. If I add a new one, so if I just close that, and if I add a new country to the bottom, so let's call it Vernal's Land, and that's going to be in Europe. If I go back and I run my query now, it's in there. So when you rerun your query, it uses the latest version of the data. It doesn't save a list of the results, it saves the instructions on how to find it. So if you change the data in any way, the results will be updated. Actually, you can add information in the query as well. So if you just close that, I'm going to delete my Vernal's Land record, and I'm going to go back to my query. So now we're back to 10 countries with land in the name. So let's call it Vernal's Land, and let's say it's in Europe. So we can add extra records in the query itself, although because we can only see 2 of the fields there, obviously we can't complete the whole record. So if there were compulsory fields, if you used validation on any of your other fields that weren't there, you might run into errors. But if I go back to my table now, I might need to close that and reopen it before I could see that. So if I go to the bottom, we can see that the query has actually added that country to the table.